The mud at Appomattox smells like iron and exhaustion. It is April 9th, 1865. The apple trees are just beginning to bloom. There is something cruel about that, the way the world insists on beauty while men are being buried. James Longstreet stands outside the McLean house. He has not slept. His right arm still hangs wrong from the wound he took at the Wilderness. A wound, some said, that came from his own men. A mistake in the fog. A bullet that found the wrong uniform. He does not speak of it. He simply holds himself upright, the way men who have carried too much for too long learn to do. Not proud, not broken, just still. Inside, Robert E. Lee is signing the document that ends the Army of Northern Virginia. Longstreet does not go in. He stays outside, leaning against a fence post, watching the Union officers drift past. And then one of them stops. A short man in a mud-splattered uniform, his beard unkempt, a cigar tucked in the corner of his mouth. He looks more like a clerk who lost his horse than the general who just received the surrender of the Confederacy. Ulysses Grant. The two men look at each other, and then Grant crosses the yard, quietly, without ceremony. He extends his hand. And Longstreet, who has known this man since West Point, who played cards with him on the Rio Grande, who stood at his wedding as a groomsman, who watched him get drunk and get sad and get back up. Longstreet takes it. Pete, Grant says. The old nickname, the one from before all of this. Longstreet nods. They don't say much. They don't need to, because James Longstreet has known for 3 years how this was going to end. He has known since Cold Harbor. He has known since the Wilderness. He has known, if he is honest with himself, since Gettysburg. Since the moment he stood on the ridgeline above Cemetery Ridge and told Lee, with all the quiet urgency of a man who can see the arithmetic running out, that the charge would not work. He knew. He has always known. And the tragedy of James Longstreet, the specific, precise tragedy, is not that he was wrong. It is that he was right. And no one listened. And now here he is, in an apple orchard in Virginia, shaking the hand of the man he tried to warn them about. This is where our story ends. Now let us go back to where it begins. This is not a story about the Civil War. It is not a story about tactics or terrain, or the merits of the Minié ball versus the smoothbore musket. It is not a debate about whether Lee should have fought defensively from the beginning, or whether the Confederacy was ever truly viable, or what might have happened if Jackson had survived Chancellorsville. Those are interesting questions, but they are not this story. This is a story about what happens when one man sees the truth clearly, and the people around him would rather be comfortable than correct. This is the story of James Longstreet, the man who knew. He knew what Ulysses Grant was before Grant was Ulysses Grant. He knew it from watching him, from sitting across tables with him, from understanding, with the particular clarity of a man who pays attention to small things, that this was not a general who would stop, not because he was brilliant, not because he was inspired, but because he had decided not to, because he had looked at the arithmetic of war, the ugly, unglamorous math of it, and had made his peace with it. Longstreet understood Grant the way you understand a river. You don't beat a river. You don't outflank a river. You don't inspire your men to charge at a river and hope it retreats out of admiration for their courage. A river just keeps going. Lee never understood that. Or perhaps, more accurately, Lee understood it and refused to believe it, which is a different kind of failure, and a more expensive one. This is a story about comfort, about the seduction of a framework that has always worked before, about the particular arrogance of genius, the way that a man who has been right so many times can convince himself that being right is his permanent condition. It is a story about what happens when the old rules die. And the men who are still playing by them don't realise it yet. In the summer of 1844, a young officer named James Longstreet arrived at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. He was 23 years old. He was from Georgia, but his blood was a mixture of things: South Carolina, New Jersey, wandering. The kind of man who belonged to no single place, and therefore observed all of them clearly. At Jefferson Barracks, he met Ulysses Grant. Grant was not impressive. That is the first thing you must understand. He was not a man who filled rooms. He was not a man who inspired speeches to be written about him on the spot. He was quiet and slightly rumpled, and he had a way of looking at you that made you feel he was doing a calculation inside his head, not a malicious one, not a strategic one, just the simple accounting of a man who processed the world in terms of what it actually was rather than what people claimed it to be. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary young officer, except for one thing: he did not stop. Longstreet noticed this, not in a dramatic way, not in the way that it later became a famous observation in history books. He noticed it the way you notice the weather, because it was simply there, present, a fact of the environment. They played cards together. Brag, mostly. The game where you win, not by having the best hand, but by convincing the other man that you do. Grant was not a gifted liar, but he was almost impossible to bluff. He would sit there, looking at his cards with that same quiet expression, and he would call, quietly, repeatedly. He would absorb losses without changing his face, and he would continue playing. There was no performance to it. That was the thing. So many men perform confidence. They swagger. They declare. They want you to know how unafraid they are. Grant was not performing. He simply continued. Longstreet watched this. They served together in the Mexican-American War in 1846 and 1847, and there again, on the dusty road south of the Rio Grande, Longstreet watched Grant, watched him under fire, watched him in the chaos of street fighting in Monterey, watched him ride through active combat to retrieve ammunition for his men, because the men needed it and he was the one who could get it, and that was the entirety of the calculation. No philosophy, no grand gesture. Just. Here is the problem. Here is what I can do about it. I will now do it. Longstreet filed this away. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the archive that careful men keep about the world, he wrote it down. Not on paper, just in the way a man writes things down when he knows, without knowing why he knows, that the information will matter later. He was right. It mattered 17 years later. At a cost no one had the capacity to imagine in 1847, when the apple trees were blooming in Mexico and the war was still young, and everyone still believed that courage was the decisive variable in human conflict. It is never just courage. James Longstreet knew that. Ulysses Grant knew that. Robert E. Lee, God help him, did not. Let us be precise about what James Longstreet believed. He was not a coward. No man who led from the front at Antietam, who held the Confederate right at Fredericksburg while the Union Army shattered itself against his positions, who drove through the Union left at Chickamauga with the kind of precision that made professional soldiers weep. No such man can be called a coward. The charge would come later, from lesser men, and we will get to that. But Longstreet had a quality that great soldiers sometimes have, and great commanders almost never survive having. He saw the war as it was, not as he wished it to be. And what he saw, by the summer of 1863, was a crisis of framework. The Confederate military genius, and it was genius, genuine and remarkable, was built on a specific philosophy: strike fast, hit hard. Make the cost of fighting you so psychologically unbearable that your enemy's will collapses before their army does. It worked against McClellan, who was timid. It worked against Pope, who was arrogant. It worked against Hooker, who was undone by his own nerve. It worked because it relied on a specific vulnerability in the Union command structure: the willingness of Union generals to stop, to reassess, to pull back and reconsider. Longstreet understood, with terrible clarity, that Grant did not have that vulnerability. He said this. He said it in the way that men say important things when they have already decided they will probably not be heard, quietly, insistently, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been correct before and knows what it costs. Before Gettysburg, he argued against the invasion of Pennsylvania, not because he lacked faith in the army. He argued against it because he understood what Lee did not yet want to understand, that the Confederacy could not win an attrition war, that every man lost in an offensive battle in Pennsylvania was a man they could not replace, that the correct strategy was not to defeat the Union Army in the field. It was to make the political cost of continuing the war too high for the North to bear. Defend. Make them come to you. Make them bleed for every ridge and every tree line. Make the arithmetic unacceptable to them before it becomes unacceptable to you. Lee heard this. Lee nodded. Lee did what great men who are also proud men do when they receive counsel that conflicts with their instincts. He listened politely, and then he trusted his instincts. Because his instincts had always been right before. Because he had broken every general the Union sent against him. Because he was Robert E. Lee, and his soldiers would follow him to the edge of the world. And the edge of the world, surely, must be enough. This is the seduction of past success. This is the opium of a framework that has never failed. You stop seeing the data. You see the pattern you have come to expect. You see the framework functioning, the way it has always functioned, and you cannot quite believe, you cannot quite make yourself believe, that the new situation does not fit the old shape. On the first day of July, 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia descended on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Longstreet opposed the attack on Cemetery Ridge from the first moment he surveyed the ground. He looked at the Union position. He looked at the open ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. Nearly a mile of grass with no cover, no dead ground, no protection from the artillery massed on the heights above. He looked at it with the eyes of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying what rifle fire and cannon fire do to men in the open, and he said, quietly, that the charge would fail. Lee looked at the same ground, and Lee said, "The men will carry it," because they always had. The difference between Lee and Longstreet in that moment is the difference between faith and analysis. Lee had faith in his men, in his army, in the moral and martial superiority of Confederate soldiers who had proved their courage over and over and over again. Longstreet had analysis. He did not doubt the courage of the men. He doubted the ground, the distance, the mathematics of exposure, time versus fire density. Courage, he understood, does not rewrite arithmetic. The charge was ordered. Longstreet did not want to give the order. He said later that he could not speak the word, that he simply nodded, because his voice would have broken, and he was not going to let his men see that. He watched them go. He watched 12,000 men walk into that open field. He watched the Union artillery open up. He watched the arithmetic run. Ulysses Grant took command of all Union armies in March of 1864. And then something happened that had never happened to Robert E. Lee in 3 years of war. The enemy did not stop. Lee won at the Wilderness. The fighting was brutal and confused, and the woods caught fire, and men burned alive in the underbrush, and it was the kind of nightmare that had broken Union commanders before, that had sent them back across the Potomac to regroup and reconsider and give Lee the space he needed to breathe and manoeuvre. Grant moved south. Lee hit him again at Spotsylvania. Vicious fighting. Brutal, close-range combat at the Bloody Angle, where men fought hand-to-hand across a log barricade for 18 hours in the rain. The kind of fighting that drains an army, that costs irreplaceable men and irreplaceable officers, and leaves a wound in the organisational body that never quite heals. Grant moved south. This was new. This was something Lee's framework had no room for. Every instinct he had, every lesson the war had taught him, said that after a battle like Spotsylvania, the Union Army would stop, would pull back, would give him the operational pause he needed to replenish, to reposition, to do what he did, to be brilliant in the space that cautious Union commanders always provided. There was no space. Grant was not cautious. Grant was not reckless either. This is important because the mythology often collapses him into a butcher, a man who won through numbers alone. But that is not what Longstreet saw when he looked at Grant. Longstreet saw a man who had simply decided that the Confederate strategy required space to function, and that the correct response was to provide no space. Move, press, maintain contact, refuse to reset. Cold Harbor, in June of 1864, was Lee's last real strategic victory of the war. Grant attacked the Confederate entrenchments in a frontal assault that failed catastrophically. 7th Union casualty in an hour. It was the kind of assault that should have broken a general. That should have sent him back across the Rappahannock to explain himself to Lincoln. Grant acknowledged the mistake, and then he moved south, to Petersburg. And there, at Petersburg, the war became the war that Longstreet had been describing since 1862. A siege. A grinding, attritional contest that the Confederacy, with its smaller population and diminishing industrial base, could not win. Not through courage, not through tactical brilliance, not through the genius of Robert E. Lee, who walked the lines at Petersburg every day and knew, with the particular knowledge of a brilliant man finally confronting the truth he has been avoiding, that there was no way out of this arithmetic. Longstreet was not at Petersburg. He was still recovering from his wound. He returned to command in October 1864, in time for the final months, in time to watch the end arriving, measured and inevitable, like a tide. He watched his old friend apply pressure, constantly, remorselessly. Not with hatred. Grant had none of Lee's romantic philosophy of war, but he also had none of its cruelty. He simply pressed. He extended the Union lines. He forced Lee to extend to match him. He waited for the line to break. It broke on April 2nd, 1865. Petersburg fell. Richmond fell. The army began its final march, not toward victory, but toward Appomattox, though they did not know the name of the place yet. They only knew the direction and the weight of the men behind them, and the fact that the roads west were running out. On April 7th, Grant sent a note to Lee through the lines. The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance. Lee showed the note to Longstreet. Longstreet read it. He handed it back. He said, "Not yet." But he knew. He had always known. 2 days later, the army reached Appomattox Courthouse. The apple trees were just beginning to bloom. And so we are back in the yard outside the McLean house. April 9th, 1865. The mud, the quiet, the impossible, cruel beauty of the spring. James Longstreet stands at the fence post. His right arm still hangs wrong. He has not slept. He is 43 years old and he looks 60, the way soldiers do when they have done real work for real years. He watches the Union officers drift past, the way a man watches a river after the flood, acknowledging the power of it, the finality of it, without any longer arguing against it. And then Grant crosses the yard. That short, mud-splattered man, that clerk who lost his horse, the man who did not stop. The man Longstreet watched play cards on the Rio Grande in 1846, absorbing losses without changing his face, calling every hand, continuing. Grant extends his hand. "Pete," he says. And in that single word is everything. The weight of 20 years, the card games, the Mexican roads, the wedding, the long gap of the war, when they were on opposite sides of a country that was tearing itself apart, and they each did their jobs with a thoroughness that cost more than either of them will ever be able to say. The charge at Gettysburg, the bloody angle, the siege lines at Petersburg, the notes sent through the lines, the hopelessness of further resistance. Longstreet takes the hand. He doesn't say much. What is there to say? He knew this man. He told them who this man was. He told them in 1863, in his arguments before Gettysburg, that you cannot defeat a general who refuses to stop. You can only make it too expensive for him to continue, and you do that by defending, not by charging. He told them, and they heard him, and they thanked him for his counsel, and then they gave the order, and 12,000 men walked into that open field. He gave the nod. He watched them go. And now he is standing in an apple orchard in Virginia, holding the hand of the man he tried to warn them about, and the word that hangs between them, that single syllable, that old nickname from a different world, Pete, is perhaps the most devastating sentence in the history of American warfare. Because it means, I know you. And it means, I have always known you. And it means, it did not have to end this way. James Longstreet went home to Georgia after the war. He did not go quietly into bitterness, which might have been easier, or quietly into silence, which might have been safer. He went into business. He joined the Republican Party. He supported Reconstruction. He accepted a federal appointment from his old friend, President Ulysses Grant, and he served the government that had defeated him. In the South, this was not merely unpopular, it was unforgivable. And so the erasure began. It began with whispers, then pamphlets, then books. It grew into what became known as the Lost Cause, that elaborate, carefully constructed mythology that reframed Confederate defeat not as the inevitable result of a fundamentally flawed strategy encountering an opponent who had no exploitable weakness, but as a noble cause betrayed by lesser men. By incompetence. By one man, specifically, who had been slow at Gettysburg, who had not attacked with sufficient urgency on the second day, who had, through his foot-dragging and his strategic timidity and his fundamental failure of faith in the rightness of the Confederate cause, handed victory to the North. That man, in this story, was James Longstreet. Jubal Early led the charge. Early, who had lost more men per engagement than Longstreet had and won fewer results, who had been routed by Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, with a thoroughness that should have ended his reputation permanently, became the chief architect of the lost cause narrative. He wrote, he spoke, he organised. He had help from former Confederate officers who needed someone to blame, from a Southern public that needed the grief and the shame of defeat to have a human face, from a culture that had built its entire identity on the righteousness of its cause and could not, psychologically, could not, accept that the cause had failed on its own merits. And so they gave it a face. Longstreet's face. The charges were specific. He was slow at Gettysburg. He should have attacked at dawn on July 2nd. His delay cost them the battle that cost them the war. Everything that followed, the siege of Petersburg, Appomattox, Reconstruction, everything, could be traced back to one man's failure of nerve on one July morning in Pennsylvania. This was historically false. Military historians have established this with the kind of evidentiary thoroughness that should have settled the matter permanently. Longstreet's attack on July 2nd was not ordered until mid-afternoon. He attacked almost immediately after the order was given. The delay was not his. And even if it had been, even if he had attacked at dawn, the Confederate position at Gettysburg was fundamentally compromised before a single gun was fired, because Lee had chosen to attack a heavily fortified Union position across open ground with an army that could not afford the casualties. This is the thing that the lost cause could never afford to say. Because to say it would be to say that Lee was wrong, and Lee, in the mythology that hardened around his name like amber, could not be wrong. Lee was the hero of the story. Lee was the great and tragic figure, noble in defeat, magnificent in loss. If Lee was wrong, if the strategy was wrong, if the philosophy was wrong, if the entire framework of aggressive, attrition-blind, offensive warfare was wrong, then the tragedy is not that they lost. The tragedy is that they never had a chance, and that is a truth too heavy to carry. So they blamed Longstreet instead. They tore down his statues while they built Lee's. They wrote him out of the histories, or they wrote him in as the villain, the slow one, the doubter, the man who lacked faith when faith was what was needed. They made him a scapegoat with the specific, desperate energy of people who cannot confront their own failure, who cannot look at what the record actually shows, who need the story to be about a betrayal rather than a miscalculation. Because miscalculations are frightening. Miscalculations mean the framework was wrong. And if the framework was wrong, then all the courage, all the sacrifice, all the blood and the loss and the grief, all of it was poured into a shape that was never going to hold. Longstreet lived until 1904. He watched it happen. He wrote his memoirs. He defended himself. He stated, with the particular weariness of a man who has been right too many times and paid too high a price for it, that the charge at Gettysburg was a mistake, that he said so at the time, that Lee was great, but Lee was wrong, that the war ended the way it had to end given the strategy that was chosen and the opponent that was faced. They called him a traitor for saying it. They called him a liar. They called him a Republican, which in that time and place was meant as the most comprehensive insult available. He died in Gainesville, Georgia, in January of 1904. He was 82 years old. He had outlived almost everyone who had argued about him, which is a kind of grim victory. He was buried without the ceremonies that were given to other Confederate generals. He had been, for the purposes of the history being written, erased. Here is what James Longstreet understood. He understood that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is not ignorance. Ignorance is manageable. You can educate ignorance. You can show ignorance the facts, and, if the facts are clear enough, ignorance will update. Ignorance is uncomfortable with being wrong because it doesn't know it is wrong, but once it knows, it can change. The dangerous thing is comfort. Comfort is knowing, or half-knowing. Comfort is the framework that has worked before, the pattern that has delivered success. The methodology that your whole identity has been built around proving is correct. Comfort is the general who has broken 10 Union armies and therefore cannot quite believe that the 11th will be different. Comfort is the confidence that is not arrogance exactly. Lee was never arrogant in the petty sense, but is something more insidious. The certainty of a man who has been right so many times that being right has become, in his mind, a permanent condition rather than a contingent one. Grant had no such comfort. Grant had learned, in the hard and unglamorous years before the war, the years of failure in business, the years of poverty, the years of proving to no one in particular that he was capable of being adequate at ordinary things. Grant had learned that the world does not owe you a pattern. That last time's solution is not necessarily this time's solution, that you must look at what is actually in front of you and respond to that, rather than to your memory of how this usually goes. This is why he didn't stop. Not because he was callous, not because he was a butcher who did not feel the weight of the casualties. The record suggests otherwise. But because he had done the fundamental analysis and arrived at a conclusion that Lee, for reasons of psychology and culture and pride and genius, could not arrive at. There is no move Lee can make that will end this. There is no brilliant flanking manoeuvre, no inspired counterstroke, no moment of Confederate tactical perfection that changes the underlying arithmetic. The Confederacy cannot replace what it loses. The Union can. Therefore, the correct strategy is to prevent Lee from ever operating in the space where his brilliance matters. To press. To maintain contact. To refuse to give him the pause he needs to reset. To be, in effect, a river. Longstreet saw this. Longstreet had always seen this. And the specific tragedy of James Longstreet is that seeing it clearly and saying it clearly and being right about it, none of that was enough. Because the community around him needed the old story, needed the old framework, needed the war to be about courage and nobility and the rightness of the cause, because if it wasn't about those things, if it was just about numbers and industrial capacity and an opponent who had decided not to stop, then the grief was not tragedy. It was just loss. And loss, without meaning, is unbearable. So they made it mean something. They made it mean that one man failed them, rather than the framework failed them, the philosophy failed them. The inability to look at their opponent clearly, to see him as he actually was rather than as they expected him to be, failed them. They could not say that. They could not say, "We were wrong about the kind of war this was." So they said, Longstreet was slow. History has been slowly, imperfectly, incompletely correcting this record for 160 years. The serious military historians have largely settled the question. The statues have not all come down. The mythology has not entirely died. These things rarely do, because they are not really about history. They are about the psychological cost of admitting that the map was wrong, that the territory was different from what you believed, that someone told you so and you did not listen, and you will have to carry that. So let us say it clearly, here, at the end. James Longstreet understood Ulysses Grant before the war began. He watched him on the Rio Grande. He watched him play cards without blinking. He watched him ride through active fire because the men needed ammunition and he was the one who could get it. He watched him, for years, process the world in terms of what it actually was. And he recognised, with the particular recognition of a perceptive man watching a dangerous one, that this was the kind of soldier who would not stop. He tried to tell them. He told them at Gettysburg, on the ridgeline above the open field, looking at the 12,000 men about to walk into the space between the armies. He told them with the quiet insistence of a man who has already accepted that he will not be heard, but who says it anyway because not saying it would be a kind of cowardice. They didn't listen. They gave the order. He gave the nod. He watched them go. And 22 months later, he stood in an apple orchard in Virginia and took the hand of the man he had tried to warn them about, and the old nickname hung between them like smoke, like grief, like the specific weight of everything that was true and early and unspeakable. Pete. This is how James Longstreet should be remembered. Not as the man who was slow at Gettysburg. Not as the traitor who joined the Republicans. Not as the scapegoat that a broken cause needed to make sense of its breaking. But as the man who looked at the future clearly, in a room full of people who were too comfortable with the past to believe him. Who said what was true when the truth was inconvenient and expensive and unwelcome. Who stood on a ridge above an open field and saw, with terrible precision, exactly what was about to happen, and watched it happen anyway. Because sometimes being right is not enough. Sometimes the world is not ready for what you know, and the bravest thing a man can do, the hardest thing, the thing that costs the most and pays out least, is to say it anyway. To look at the river and call it a river. To see the general who will not stop and say, "This general will not stop." To stand in the aftermath, in the mud and the apple blossoms, and shake the hand of the man who proved you right. Without saying, "I told you so," because he already knows. He always knew.